Okay, in our next video presentation, we are now ready to discuss the last type of research according to the levels of investigation, and that is experimental research. Okay, so in experimental research, okay, this type of research includes, it includes different types of variables. Okay? Also, the aim of experimental research, it aims to study the effect of these variables. Okay? The variables. So, meaning to say, experimental research includes a lot of variables and it aims to study the effect of these variables towards one another. Okay? Later on, this would be discussed even further, but for now, let us identify the two main types of variables in experimental research. So, there are two main types of variables in experimental research, and it was also discussed in our previous video presentations. So, the first one, so the first type of variable is the independent variable. So, the independent variable, shorthand IV, and the next one is the dependent variable, shorthand DV. So, independent variable is the variable or the one being manipulated. Being manipulated. Manipulated by who? By the researchers. So, whenever we say manipulated, the independent variable can be changed. Okay? It can be changed for a specific setup, whatsoever. And it is also the variable that gives the cost. It imposes the cost. Okay? The dependent variable, however, the dependent variable is the variable that depends on the IV. Is the variable that depends on the independent variable. And also, it is the variable that takes the effect caused by the independent variable. So that is the main difference between the two main types of variables, the independent and dependent variables. Okay, so to discuss experimental research as a type of research under the category of levels of investigation, we will have this illustration or example. So let us have this example. Okay. So for instance, we have the wavelength. So this symbolizes wavelength. Wavelength. So for instance, we have the wavelength, as our independent variable. Okay? And then we will have the energy produced as our dependent variable. Okay? So the energy produced greatly let's say the energy produced greatly depends on the length or the amount of wavelength. Okay? So remember that in the electromagnetic spectrum or EM spectrum, in your grade 7 sciences, we have the so-called white light. White light. Okay? And the white light or the visible light is actually the combination of all colors. Combination of all colors. So this white light or visible light produces, it produces, wavelengths. Different wavelengths. Because different colors have different wavelengths. Okay? And in the white light also, we have the so-called infrared lights and ultraviolet lights. So, I think you are very familiar with this. Infrared, from the prefix infra, meaning below. So, meaning it is the wavelength below red, infrared. Next, ultra from the prefix ultraviolet from the prefix ultra, meaning beyond. So, meaning to say, ultraviolet is the wavelength beyond violet, or it is the wavelength above violet. Okay? So, in our illustration, as the wavelength increases, okay, as the wavelength increases, it will have an effect on the energy produced, since the energy produced greatly depends on the amount of wavelength. So, as the wavelength increases, the energy produced decreases. Okay? So, meaning to say, there is an inverse relationship. Okay? As the wavelength increases, the energy decreases. It is also the same as in the essence that as the wavelength decreases, the energy, however, increases. Okay. So, from here, we describe the effect of variables towards one another. Okay? We describe the effect of the independent variable towards the dependent variable. And what is that effect of variables? As the wavelength increases, the energy decreases. As the wavelength decreases, the energy increases. So we describe the effects of variables towards one another. So as you can see, these types, okay, the three types of relationships. I mean, let's say, so as you can see, these three kinds of researches, rather, these three kinds of relationships, exploratory, descriptive, and experimental, they all focus mainly on the relationship of variables and how they are being investigated. But how do they differ from one another? Okay? In exploratory, we only answer a simple question without the presence of experimentation and without the presence of graphs. Okay? While in the descriptive research, it describes the relationship. It answers the question what, how, when, and where without answering why. It only describes the relationship between variables. Is it indirect? Is it inverse? Is it scattered? Is it curvilinear? Lastly, experimental research experiments on the effects of variables, specifically the effect of IV towards the dependent variable. So that is how these three are differentiated. Now, in our next video presentation, we are now ready to discuss the classification of research according to the type of analysis.